The dagger felt cold against Cecilia's thigh, hidden beneath the layers of silk and lace that composed her wedding gown, a gown that felt more like a shroud than a symbol of joy. Her hands trembled as she stood alone in the vast bedchamber of Ravenswood Manor, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the dark mahogany furniture and the imposing four-poster bed that seemed to loom like a gallows. This was her wedding night, but there would be no tenderness here, no whispered promises of devotion or gentle caresses. This night had been designed as her punishment, a public humiliation orchestrated by the crown itself, and the man who would soon walk through that door was the architect of her family's destruction. General Alexander Thornfield, the Conde de Ravenswood, the merciless military commander who had led the royal forces against her father's rebellion, crushing it with such brutal efficiency that the name Hartwell had become synonymous with treason and shame throughout England. Lady Cecilia Hartwell, once the beloved daughter of a respected nobleman, had been reduced to nothing more than a political pawn, a living reminder of what happened to those who dared defy the throne. The whispers had followed her like a plague ever since her father's execution. Society no longer saw her as an innocent girl caught in the wake of her father's choices. They saw her as tainted blood, a traitor's daughter who deserved whatever fate befell her. The other ladies of the ton had turned their backs on her at every social gathering. Their fans snapping shut as she passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. Even her own distant relatives had refused to take her in after the crown seized the Hartwell estates, leaving her to survive on the charity of a cold-hearted aunt who reminded her daily that she was a burden, a stain on the family name that could never be washed clean. And then had come the summons, the royal decree that felt like a death sentence wrapped in the language of mercy. She was to marry General Thornfield, the very man who had killed her father's dream of a free England, the man whose tactical brilliance had led to the slaughter of hundreds of rebels on the fields of Ashford Heath. The crown called it clemency, a generous offer to spare her from destitution and restore a semblance of respectability to her ruined name. But Cecilia knew the truth. This marriage was designed to break her spirit completely, to force her into the bed of her family's greatest enemy as the ultimate humiliation. The ceremony that morning had been a cold, lifeless affair held in the private chapel of the Thornfield estate, attended only by a handful of witnesses required by law and a stern-faced bishop who had rushed through the vows as though he feared contamination from her presence. Alexander had stood beside her like a statue carved from ice, his tall frame rigid in his military dress uniform, his dark eyes revealing nothing as he repeated the binding words that made her his wife, his property under the law. He had not looked at her once during the entire ceremony, had not offered even the pretense of a reassuring glance or a gentle touch, and when the bishop had pronounced them man and wife, Alexander had merely nodded curtly and turned away, leaving her standing alone at the altar like a forgotten piece of furniture. The wedding breakfast had been even worse, a silent meal where she sat at the far end of a long table, while Alexander reviewed military correspondence, not even acknowledging her existence as servants moved soundlessly around them. Now, as the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, Cecilia's fingers found the hilt of the dagger once more, drawing strength from its solid presence. She had smuggled the weapon from her aunt's house, a small blade that had once belonged to her mother, and she had spent the past 3 weeks imagining this very moment. In her mind, she had rehearsed it 1,000 times, the way she would wait until he was vulnerable, perhaps asleep or distracted, and then she would drive the blade into his heart, avenging her father, her family, her stolen future. It did not matter that she would hang for it, did not matter that her own life would end on the scaffold, just as her father's had, because at least she would die knowing that she had struck back against the man who had taken everything from her. The fantasy of revenge had been the only thing keeping her sane during these impossible weeks, the only thought that allowed her to walk down that aisle without screaming, to sit through that mockery of a wedding breakfast without shattering into 1,000 pieces. The sound of boots in the hallway made her heart hammer against her ribs, and she pressed herself back against the bedpost, her hand moving instinctively to the hidden blade. This was the moment. This was when the monster would come to claim his spoils, to complete her degradation by taking what little remained of her dignity. The door opened slowly, and Alexander Thornfield entered the room, still in his uniform, though he had removed his jacket, his white shirt open at the collar revealing the strong column of his throat. He was a powerfully built man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room, and his face, though undeniably handsome with its strong jaw and aristocratic features, was set in lines of such severe control that it seemed incapable of warmth. He closed the door behind him with a quiet click, and for a long moment he simply stood there, studying her with those unreadable dark eyes that had watched men die without flinching. Cecilia's courage surged through her veins like wildfire, and before she could second-guess herself, she drew the dagger from its hiding place, holding it before her with both hands, despite their violent trembling. She expected him to react with anger, perhaps to lunge for her or call for the guards, but Alexander Thornfield did something that shattered every assumption she had built around him. He smiled, a sad, weary expression that touched his eyes with something that looked almost like relief, and his voice when he finally spoke was low and rough, carrying a weight of exhaustion that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul, and his words were an invitation to end his suffering, a confession that perhaps the monster she had created in her mind was just a man who had been waiting for his punishment to finally arrive. The dagger slipped from Cecilia's fingers, clattering against the polished wooden floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the heavy silence of the bedchamber. She stared at Alexander Thornfield, her mind struggling to reconcile the words he had just spoken with the image of the ruthless general she had constructed in her imagination over the past months. This man, who stood before her with shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 regrets, was not supposed to invite his own death. He was supposed to be cruel, tyrannical, a monster who reveled in the suffering he had caused her family. But the expression on his face told a different story entirely, one written in lines of grief and self-recrimination that no amount of military discipline could fully conceal. Alexander made no move to retrieve the fallen weapon, did not advance toward her or retreat, but simply stood there as though he had been carved from stone, waiting for her to make the choice that would determine both their fates. To understand how they had arrived at this impossible moment, one must journey back 6 months to a time when Lady Cecilia Hartwell still possessed hope, however fragile, for her future. Her father, Lord Edmund Hartwell, had been a passionate man, a nobleman who believed deeply in the rights of common people and had grown increasingly vocal in his criticism of the Crown's heavy taxation and authoritarian policies. What had begun as political speeches in Parliament had gradually escalated into something far more dangerous, a network of like-minded nobles and commoners who shared his vision of a reformed England, one where power was more equitably distributed and the voices of ordinary citizens carried weight. Cecilia had been only 17 when her father's political activities had transformed from passionate discourse into outright rebellion, and she had watched with growing dread as he had recruited supporters, stockpiled weapons, and made plans that he assured her would bring about a better world for all English people. She had loved her father dearly, had admired his conviction and his courage, but even in her youth she had understood that the path he had chosen could only end in tragedy. The rebellion had lasted barely 3 months before the Crown had dispatched General Alexander Thornfield to crush it with overwhelming force. Thornfield had been the youngest general in the King's army, a brilliant military strategist who had earned his reputation through a series of decisive victories on the continent, and his appointment to command the Loyalist forces had been met with celebration in London and despair among the rebels. Cecilia had been at the family's country estate when news of the Battle of Ashford Heath had arrived, the devastating engagement where her father's poorly trained forces had been systematically destroyed by Thornfield's professional soldiers. The reports had been horrific, hundreds of rebels killed, the survivors scattered or captured, and her father taken prisoner, along with his closest advisors. She had never seen her father again after that terrible day, for he had been tried swiftly in London, convicted of high treason, and executed on Tower Hill before she could even obtain permission to visit him in his cell. The aftermath had been swift and merciless. The Crown had seized all Hartwell properties, stripping the family of every asset, every piece of land, every penny that might have provided Cecilia with a future. Her mother, already in fragile health, had died of a broken heart within weeks of her husband's execution, leaving Cecilia truly alone in a world that now viewed her as the daughter of a traitor. She had been forced to take refuge with her father's sister, a bitter woman who had married well and who resented every moment that Cecilia remained under her roof, a constant reminder of the scandal that had touched their family name. For 5 months, Cecilia had endured a half-life, trapped between the world she had lost and an uncertain future, forbidden from attending social events, cut off from former friends who feared association with her, existing in a grey limbo where each day felt like a small death. Then had come the summons from the royal court, delivered by an official in elaborate livery, who had looked at her with barely concealed contempt as he handed her the sealed document. She had broken the wax seal with trembling fingers, expecting perhaps a final confiscation, some last humiliation the crown had devised to punish the Hartwell name. Instead, she had found herself reading words that made no sense. A royal decree announcing her betrothal to General Alexander Thornfield, Conde de Ravenswood, the marriage to take place within the month. Her aunt had called it a miracle, a generous act of mercy that would restore Cecilia to society and provide her with the protection of a powerful husband. But Cecilia had understood immediately what the Tun would see, what the entire country would whisper about when the announcement appeared in the papers. The traitor's daughter forced to marry the man who had destroyed her family, a living symbol of the crown's absolute power and the futility of resistance. The weeks following the wedding were unlike anything Cecilia had imagined, and the reality of her new life at Ravenswood Manor proved far more complex than the simple narrative of captor and captive she had constructed in her mind. Alexander Thornfield was rarely present during those early days, spending his mornings locked away in his study, attending to military correspondence, and his afternoons riding alone across the vast estate that had been in his family for generations. He did not demand her presence at meals, did not insist on the wifely duties that were his legal right, and indeed seemed to go out of his way to avoid any interaction beyond the coldly polite acknowledgements required when they passed each other in the corridors. The servants treated her with cautious respect, uncertain of her position in the household hierarchy, taking their cues from their master's distant behavior and offering her the courtesy due to a countess while maintaining a careful emotional distance. Cecilia found herself living as a ghost in the grand manor, occupying elegant rooms filled with priceless furniture and artwork, yet feeling more isolated than she had even in her aunt's hostile household. Society's reaction to the marriage had been exactly as brutal as she had feared. The announcement in the London papers had sparked a frenzy of gossip and speculation, with every drawing room in England dissecting the scandalous union between the war hero and the traitor's daughter. When Alexander had finally insisted she accompany him to a small dinner party, hosted by a fellow officer, Cecilia had endured an evening of thinly veiled insults and pointed silences, where the other ladies had examined her as though she were an exotic and slightly distasteful curiosity. She had heard the whispers as she passed, the speculation about whether the general had married her out of some perverse desire to own a trophy from his greatest victory, or whether the crown had forced the match as punishment for some unknown transgression on his part. No one, it seemed, could believe that Alexander Thornfield would willingly choose to bind himself to such tainted blood, and their inability to understand the match only fed more vicious rumors about her character and his motives. Yet despite the coldness of their arrangement and the hostility of the world around them, Cecilia began to notice small details about her husband that did not align with the merciless killer she had expected. The library at Ravenswood was extensive, filled with volumes on philosophy, poetry, and political theory, many of them annotated in Alexander's precise handwriting with observations that revealed a thoughtful, questioning mind rather than the blind obedience of a military automaton. She discovered that he personally oversaw the welfare of every family on his estate, that his tenants spoke of him with genuine respect rather than fear, and that he had established a fund to provide education for the children of his servants and workers. More puzzling still were the nights when she would wake, to hear him pacing the corridors, the sound of his boots echoing through the manor in the darkest hours, suggesting a man tormented by something that would not let him rest. The turning point came on a grey afternoon when Cecilia, exploring the grounds to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house, discovered Alexander in the estate's private chapel. She had not intended to intrude, had been merely seeking a quiet place to think, but something about the way he knelt before the altar stopped her at the doorway. His head was bowed, his shoulders bent in a posture of such profound anguish that it seemed his very soul was being crushed under an invisible weight. She watched, transfixed, as this man who commanded armies and inspired fear across England trembled like a penitent before God, and though she could not hear his words, she understood instinctively that he was not praying for victory or glory, but seeking forgiveness for sins that clearly haunted him every moment of his existence. When he finally rose and turned to leave, his eyes met hers across the dim space, and for the first time since their wedding night, she saw past the mask of the general to the broken man beneath. That evening, Alexander did something unprecedented. He requested her presence in the drawing room after dinner, not as a command but as a genuine invitation conveyed by a servant with unusual gentleness. Cecilia had entered the room with her defenses raised, expecting perhaps a formal discussion about household matters or social obligations, but instead found him standing by the window, staring out at the darkening grounds with a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the unspoken words and unasked questions that had accumulated over their weeks of careful avoidance, until finally Alexander began to speak, and the words that poured from him were not the cold pronouncements of a general, but the confession of a man who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally hear the truth of what had happened at Ashford Heath. Alexander's voice, when he finally broke the silence that had stretched between them like a chasm, was rough with an emotion that Cecilia had never heard from him before, a rawness that stripped away every layer of military precision and aristocratic control. He told her that he had not wanted the command, that when the king had summoned him and ordered him to crush her father's rebellion, he had understood immediately that he was being asked to do something that would stain his soul forever. The rebels were not foreign enemies or hardened criminals, they were Englishmen, many of them farmers and tradesmen who had been driven to desperation by policies that Alexander himself had privately questioned, led by a nobleman whose writings he had actually read and in his heart partially agreed with. But a soldier's duty, especially a general's duty, left no room for personal conviction or moral hesitation, and so he had accepted the command because refusal would have meant his own ruin and the disgrace of his family name, and because he had told himself that perhaps he could find a way to end the conflict with minimal bloodshed. The night before the Battle of Ashford Heath, Alexander had done something that could have cost him his commission, and possibly his life. He had sent a private messenger to Lord Edmund Hartwell under a flag of truce, offering terms of surrender that were far more generous than anything the Crown had authorized. He had proposed that if the rebels would lay down their arms and disperse peacefully, he would personally advocate to the king for clemency, arguing that these were misguided subjects who deserved mercy rather than martyrdom. Alexander's voice broke slightly as he recounted how he had waited through the long night for a response, hoping desperately that Cecilia's father would accept the offer and spare everyone the horror of what would come if battle was joined. But Edmund Hartwell, convinced of the righteousness of his cause and believing that more nobles would join his rebellion if he could win a single significant victory, had rejected the terms and prepared his forces to fight, never knowing that his decision would seal not only his own fate, but the fates of hundreds of men who trusted him. The battle itself had been a massacre, exactly as Alexander had feared. His professional soldiers, trained and disciplined, had faced off against rebels who were brave but hopelessly outmatched in tactics, equipment, and experience. Alexander had tried, even in the midst of the fighting, to minimize casualties, ordering his men to aim for wounds rather than kills whenever possible. But in the chaos and fury of combat, such orders were nearly impossible to enforce. He had watched men die, watched the fields of Ashford Heath turn red with English blood, and every death had felt like a personal failure, a condemnation of his inability to prevent the senseless tragedy. When the battle had finally ended and Lord Hartwell had been brought before him in chains, Alexander had seen not a dangerous traitor, but a man who had sacrificed everything for principles he believed in, and he had felt a respect for his prisoner that made what came next even more unbearable. Alexander had spent 3 days composing a detailed letter to the king, a passionate plea for clemency that had drawn on every bit of influence and favor he had accumulated through years of loyal service. He had argued that executing Lord Hartwell would only create a martyr and inspire future rebellions, that showing mercy would demonstrate the crown's strength and magnanimity rather than its fear. He had reminded the King of Edmund Hartwell's previous service to the realm, of his distinguished family line, of the wife and daughter who would be left destitute and alone. The letter had been his finest piece of writing, more carefully crafted than any military report, infused with genuine conviction and desperate hope. He had sent it by the fastest rider and had waited, praying that his words would be enough to save at least one life from the catastrophe he had been forced to orchestrate. The king's response had arrived just hours after Lord Hartwell's execution had already been carried out. A curt note thanking Alexander for his input, but explaining that an example had to be made, that treason of this magnitude could not be overlooked, regardless of the traitor's previous standing or family circumstances. That rejection had broken something fundamental inside Alexander Thornfield. Shattering his faith in the system, he had devoted his life to serving and leaving him hollowed out by guilt and grief. He had written to Cecilia's aunt immediately, offering financial support that had been coldly refused, and had spent months trying to find some way to make amends for the destruction he had wrought. When the king had suggested the marriage as a way to resolve the embarrassment of the Hartwell situation, Alexander had seized upon it not as a reward or a trophy, but as a chance for penance, a way to offer Cecilia the protection and security that he had failed to provide her father, even knowing that she would hate him and that he would spend the rest of his life married to a woman whose every glance would remind him of his greatest failure. Cecilia stood frozen in the drawing room, as Alexander's confession washed over her like a tide, each word dismantling the carefully constructed fortress of hatred she had built around her heart. The man before her was not the monster she had imagined during those long, bitter months of grief and isolation, but rather a prisoner of circumstance himself, trapped by duty and honor into actions that had clearly devastated him as thoroughly as they had destroyed her family. She watched as he finally turned from the window to face her, and in the firelight she could see the tracks of moisture on his cheeks, evidence that the Iron General was capable of tears after all, that beneath the uniform and the title lived a man who had been carrying an unbearable burden of guilt. Her own eyes burned with emotions she could not fully name, a confusing mixture of anger at the injustice of it all, sorrow for the waste and tragedy, and something else, something that felt dangerously like understanding, like the first fragile thread of connection between two people who had both been casualties of forces beyond their control. The days that followed that evening marked a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere at Ravenswood Manor. Alexander began to seek her company more frequently, joining her for breakfast and asking tentative questions about her childhood, her interests, the life she had lived before everything had fallen apart. These conversations were careful, almost formal at first, two wounded people circling each other like wary animals, testing whether trust might be possible between them. Cecilia found herself responding despite her initial resistance, sharing memories of her father that revealed not the dangerous rebel of official accounts, but a loving parent who had read her poetry and taught her to appreciate the beauty in nature and ideas. Alexander listened with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time since her world had collapsed. And gradually she began to understand that he was not learning about her enemy's daughter, but discovering the woman he had bound himself to, trying to know the person whose pain he had inadvertently caused. The walls between them began to crumble in unexpected moments, small instances of genuine connection that accumulated like drops of water, slowly wearing away stone. There was the afternoon when Alexander found her struggling to manage the household accounts, overwhelmed by responsibilities she had never been trained for, and instead of criticizing her inadequacy, he had sat beside her for 3 hours, patiently explaining the systems and helping her organize the ledgers. There was the evening when a fierce storm had trapped them both in the library, and they had spent hours discussing books they had both read, discovering a shared love of poetry and philosophy that transcended their opposing positions in the tragedy that had brought them together. And there was the morning when Alexander had presented her with a small portrait of her father, a miniature that he had secretly purchased from the estate sale, preserving it because he had known she would have no other image to remember him by. It was during a quiet evening in late autumn, as they sat together in the drawing room with Cecilia reading aloud from a volume of Wordsworth, that Alexander finally spoke the words that would change everything between them. He interrupted her mid-stanza, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made her heart contract, and he told her that he had not expected this, had not imagined that the marriage he had entered as penance could become something that brought him moments of genuine peace and even joy. He confessed that somewhere in the weeks of careful conversation and tentative friendship, he had begun to care for her not as an obligation or a source of guilt, but as herself, as Cecilia, the remarkable woman who had survived devastating loss with grace and who possessed a strength of spirit that humbled him. He made no demands, offered no expectations, but simply laid his heart before her with the same courage he might have shown riding into battle, acknowledging that he had no right to hope she might ever feel anything for him beyond tolerance or polite civility. Cecilia's response came not in words but in action, a gesture that surprised even herself as she crossed the space between their chairs and took his hand in hers, feeling the calluses earned from years of sword practice and the trembling that betrayed his fear of rejection. She told him that she had been prepared to hate him forever, had built her entire identity around that hatred during the dark months of grief, but that somewhere in his confession and in their careful dance toward understanding, her hatred had transformed into something far more complex and infinitely more human. She could not forget what had happened, could not pretend that her father's death did not stand between them like a ghost, but she had come to understand that Alexander had been as much a victim of that tragedy as she had been, and that perhaps two broken people might find a way to heal together, might build something new from the ruins of what they had both lost. The transformation in their relationship did not go unnoticed by the servants of Ravenswood Manor, who observed with quiet satisfaction as their master began to smile more frequently and as the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for months gradually softened. The household staff had long worried about Alexander, watching him work himself to exhaustion and pace the corridors at night like a restless spirit, and they had harbored secret hopes that his unexpected bride might bring him some measure of peace. Now they witnessed tender moments that confirmed their hopes, the way Alexander would pause in his work to seek Cecilia's opinion on estate matters, the way she would bring him tea in his study without being asked, the way their conversations would stretch long into the evening as they discovered the depths of compatibility that existed beneath the tragedy of their circumstances. Mrs. Blackwood, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Thornfield family for 40 years, remarked to the butler that she had never seen the general so animated, so truly alive as he had become in recent weeks. Yet even as their private world blossomed into something approaching genuine affection and partnership, the outside world remained hostile and unforgiving. The invitations that arrived at Ravenswood were few and often carried an undercurrent of morbid curiosity. Society hostesses eager to display the scandalous couple at their gatherings like exotic specimens for their guests to examine and dissect. Alexander had initially declined most of these invitations, sensing Cecilia's reluctance to face the judgmental stares and whispered insults. But as winter approached, he received a summons that could not be refused. The Duchess of Pemberton, one of the most powerful women in English society and a personal friend of the Queen, was hosting her annual winter ball, and her invitation was phrased as a royal command rather than a social courtesy. The ball would be the event of the season, attended by every person of consequence in London, and Alexander's absence would be noted and interpreted as either cowardice or disloyalty, neither of which he could afford given his position. When Alexander informed Cecilia of the obligation, he saw the fear flash across her face before she carefully composed her features into a mask of acceptance. She had heard enough stories about the Pemberton Ball to know that it would be an ordeal, unlike any she had yet endured, a gathering where the cream of society would be present to observe, judge, and condemn. The thought of standing before hundreds of hostile eyes, of being whispered about and scorned by women who had once been her social equals, filled her with a dread that made her hands shake. But she also understood that this was part of the price of her new position, that as the Countess of Ravenswood, she could not hide forever in the safety of the manor, and that her continued absence from society would only fuel more vicious speculation about her character and her marriage. She agreed to attend, though her agreement came with a heaviness that Alexander immediately recognized and ached to relieve. The weeks leading up to the ball were filled with preparations that felt more like preparations for battle than for a social event. Alexander hired the finest modiste in London to create a gown for Cecilia that would silence any criticism about her appearance or her worthiness to bear the Thornfield name. The result was a creation of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue of her eyes and was cut in the latest fashion, elegant and refined without being ostentatious, decorated with subtle embroidery that echoed the Thornfield family crest. When Cecilia saw herself in the mirror on the evening of the ball, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her, this countess who looked every inch the aristocrat despite the scandal that clung to her name. Alexander, resplendent in his dress uniform, with medals that testified to his service and valor, looked at her with such obvious admiration that it momentarily quieted the voices of doubt and fear that whispered in her mind. The carriage ride to Pemberton House was conducted in tense silence, with Alexander holding Cecilia's hand, in a grip that communicated both support and his own apprehension about what awaited them. He knew the ton well enough to understand that tonight would be a test, that society had been waiting for an opportunity to publicly judge his choice of bride and to determine whether the Countess of Ravenswood would be accepted or forever ostracized. As their carriage joined the long line of vehicles depositing elegantly dressed guests at the mansion's entrance, Alexander leaned close to Cecilia and spoke words that she would remember for the rest of her life, a promise that regardless of what happened in the hours ahead, she was not alone, that he stood beside her not out of duty or guilt, but because she had become essential to him, and that anyone who dared to insult her would answer to Heis. To her personally, the Pemberton ballroom was a cathedral of privilege and power, its soaring ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow prisms across the sea of silk and satin below, its walls lined with gilt mirrors that multiplied the crowd into an overwhelming infinity of judgmental faces. Cecilia felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her the moment she and Alexander were announced at the entrance, the master of ceremonies calling out their titles in a voice that seemed to echo with accusation despite its neutral tone. The conversations that had filled the air with animated chatter died away in ripples as heads turned to observe the scandalous couple, and Cecilia could feel the assessment happening in those prolonged stares, the ladies examining every detail of her appearance, while the gentlemen exchanged knowing glances that suggested they understood exactly what kind of woman would marry her family's destroyer. Alexander's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her arm as he guided her into the room, his military bearing transforming into armor against the hostility that radiated from every corner of the glittering assembly. The first hour of the ball was an exercise in social torture, more refined than any physical punishment. Ladies who had once been friends of Cecilia's mother approached with false sweetness dripping from their painted lips, offering congratulations on her marriage that were laced with barely concealed mockery and thinly veiled questions about how she could possibly bear to share a bed with the man who had killed her father. Cecilia responded with the grace her upbringing had instilled in her, her answers carefully neutral, but each encounter left invisible wounds that accumulated into a throbbing ache behind her sternum. The gentlemen were hardly better, some ignoring her entirely as though she were invisible, others offering Alexander their congratulations with smirks that suggested they believed he had claimed her as some kind of perverted war prize. Through it all, Alexander remained at her side like a stone fortress, his face carved into an expression of cold politeness that discouraged the most brazen insults but could not prevent the whispers that followed them wherever they moved through the crowd. The true cruelty began when Lady Ashworth, a woman known throughout London for her sharp tongue and her influence over social opinion, decided to make Cecilia the entertainment of the evening. She approached with a group of other prominent ladies, their fans fluttering like weapons as they surrounded Cecilia near the refreshment table, where Alexander had momentarily left her to procure champagne. Lady Ashworth's voice carried with perfect calculation, loud enough to be heard by surrounding guests, but maintaining the pretense of private conversation, as she remarked how extraordinary it was that the general had chosen to rehabilitate a traitor's daughter through marriage rather than simply providing her with a modest pension and allowing her to fade into obscurity. She wondered aloud whether Cecilia felt gratitude for being elevated so far above what her birth and circumstances now warranted, and whether she understood that her presence in respectable society was entirely dependent on her husband's tolerance and protection, a charity that could be withdrawn at any moment if she failed to properly appreciate her good fortune. The other ladies tittered behind their fans, adding their own observations about how fortunate Cecilia was that any one of Alexander's standing would overlook the stain on her family name, speculating with false sympathy about how difficult it must be for her to look at her husband without remembering that his sword had ended her father's dreams. One particularly vicious matron suggested that perhaps the marriage was actually quite fitting, that a woman born of treasonous blood deserved exactly the kind of cold political union that everyone knew the Ravenswood marriage to be, a transaction devoid of genuine affection or respect. Cecilia felt the color drain from her face as the verbal assault continued, felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the relentless cruelty, and for a terrible moment she feared she might actually flee the ballroom in tears, providing these vultures with exactly the spectacle they desired, and confirming every assumption they had made about her weakness and unworthiness. But then a voice cut through the malicious chatter like a blade through silk, a voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command and barely restrained fury. Alexander had returned, and the expression on his face was one that Cecilia had never seen before, a controlled rage that made even Lady Ashworth take an involuntary step backward. He positioned himself directly between Cecilia and her tormentors, his considerable height and military bearing transforming him into a wall of protection, and when he spoke, every person within 20 feet fell silent to hear what the general would say. The moment had arrived, the confrontation that would determine not just the success or failure of this one evening, but the entire trajectory of Cecilia's future in society, and Alexander Thornfield was about to do something that would shock every person in that glittering ballroom and reverberate through the drawing rooms of London for years to come. Alexander's voice, when he finally spoke, was not the controlled whisper of a man attempting to diffuse a difficult social situation, but rather the clear, ringing tone of a general addressing troops before battle, pitched to carry across the entire ballroom and command the attention of every person present. He informed Lady Ashworth and her circle, with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation, that they had made a grave error in their assumptions about his marriage and an even graver error in their treatment of his wife. He stated that Lady Cecilia Thornfield, Countess of Ravenswood, was not a charity case he had taken pity upon, nor was she a political inconvenience he had been forced to absorb, but rather a woman of extraordinary character whose strength, intelligence, and grace had earned his profound respect and admiration. His words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward as more and more guests turned to witness the spectacle unfolding near the refreshment table. Alexander continued without pause, his military training allowing him to maintain absolute composure, even as he delivered what amounted to a public declaration of devotion that violated every rule of aristocratic restraint. He told the assembled ladies that they had spent the evening judging a woman whose worst crime had been to be born to a father who followed his conscience, while they themselves had never shown a fraction of the courage or principle that both Lord Edmund Hartwell and his daughter possessed. He pointed out that Cecilia had endured losses and humiliations that would have broken weaker spirits, had survived with her dignity and her compassion intact, and had shown more nobility of character in her few months as his wife than most of them would demonstrate in their entire lives. The shocked gasps that greeted this assessment rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, and Cecilia could see faces throughout the ballroom registering expressions ranging from outrage to fascination to, in a few unexpected cases, what looked almost like approval. But Alexander was not finished, and what he did next would become the talk of London society for the entire season and beyond. He turned away from Lady Ashworth's circle, dismissing them as though they were insignificant, and faced Cecilia with an expression that combined tenderness with fierce determination. In front of the Duchess of Pemberton, in front of the Queen's representatives, in front of every person of consequence in English society, Alexander Thornfield dropped to one knee before his wife, taking her hand in both of his and looking up at her with eyes that held no trace of the cold general, but only the vulnerable heart of a man who had found something precious beyond measure. He spoke loudly enough for all to hear, telling Cecilia that their marriage had begun as duty and penance, but that it had become the greatest gift of his life, that she had taught him that redemption was possible and that love could grow even in the darkest soil of tragedy and regret. He told her, and through her told everyone present, that he had not saved her but that she had saved him, pulling him back from the abyss of guilt and self-hatred that had been consuming him since Ashford Heath. He declared that any person who questioned her worth or her place at his side was questioning his judgment, his honor and his devotion, and that he would consider such questioning a personal insult that demanded satisfaction. The threat was unmistakable. The general was prepared to duel over his wife's honor, to risk his reputation and possibly his life to defend her against the very society that had once celebrated him as a hero. But more than the threat, more than the dramatic gesture of kneeling before her in public, what struck everyone in that breathless moment was the raw emotion in his voice, the undeniable sincerity of a man who had stripped away every pretense and laid his heart bare for the entire world to see. Then, still on his knee, still holding her hand as though it were the most precious thing in existence, Alexander asked Cecilia a question that made the entire ballroom hold its collective breath. He asked her in front of all these witnesses if she could possibly forgive him for the pain he had caused her, if she could see past the uniform and the title to the man beneath, and if she would do him the honor of allowing their marriage to become not just a legal arrangement but a true union of hearts and souls. He was asking her to choose him, publicly and irrevocably, giving her the power in front of all of society to either validate him or destroy him. And the vulnerability of that gesture, the courage it took for this proud military commander to place his fate entirely in her hands, created a tension in the ballroom so thick it was almost suffocating. Cecilia looked down at Alexander kneeling before her. This powerful man, who had made himself vulnerable in the most public way imaginable, and felt something break open inside her chest, a dam that had been holding back a flood of emotions she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge. In that crystallized moment, with hundreds of eyes watching and the entire social order of England hanging on her response, she understood with perfect clarity that this was not just about her answer to his question, but about reclaiming her own power and agency after months of being defined by other people's narratives and judgments. The society that surrounded them had written her story as one of shame and diminishment, had cast her as a victim or a scandal or a curiosity, but Alexander was offering her the chance to rewrite that story entirely, to transform it into something that celebrated strength and love and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Her hand trembled in his as she took a breath and made her choice, speaking words that were quiet, but carried perfectly in the absolute silence that had fallen over the ballroom. She told him yes, told him that somewhere in their careful conversations and shared silences, she had discovered that forgiveness was not weakness, but rather the greatest strength, that she had learned to separate the man from the tragedy that had brought them together, and that he had shown her through his actions and his honesty that love could indeed grow in the most unlikely places. She told him that she chose him, not because she had to, not because society demanded it or because she had no other options, but because he had proven himself worthy of that choice through his integrity, his remorse, and his unwavering support. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, carrying to every corner of the ballroom, and she became aware that she was not just answering Alexander, but addressing every person who had judged her, dismissed her, or treated her as less than human because of her father's choices. She was claiming her place not as a charity case or a political inconvenience, but as a woman who had survived, who had chosen her own path, and who refused to be defined by anyone's narrative but her own. Alexander rose from his knee, and in a gesture that would be recounted in drawing rooms for years to come, he drew Cecilia into his arms and kissed her with a passion and tenderness that left no doubt in anyone's mind about the authenticity of his feelings. The kiss was not the chaste peck of aristocratic propriety, but a genuine expression of devotion, and the fact that it occurred in front of the entire Pemberton Assembly, in defiance of every rule of proper conduct, only amplified its impact. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, the ballroom erupted not in scandalized whispers but in applause, beginning with a few bold souls and spreading like wildfire until even the Duchess of Pemberton herself was clapping, a smile of genuine approval on her august face. Lady Ashworth and her circle stood frozen in mortification, realizing that their attempt to humiliate Cecilia had backfired spectacularly and that they had been publicly rebuked by one of the most powerful men in England. The remainder of the ball was transformed entirely, as though Alexander's declaration had reset the social calculus that governed the Tun's behavior. Suddenly, guests who had been avoiding Cecilia were approaching to offer genuine congratulations. Ladies who had whispered cruel speculations were now competing to secure her friendship, and gentlemen were treating Alexander with a new kind of respect that acknowledged not just his military prowess but his courage in matters of the heart. The Duchess of Pemberton herself came to speak with them, declaring in her commanding voice that any woman who could inspire such devotion from a man like General Thornfield must possess remarkable qualities, and that she would be delighted to include the Countess of Ravenswood in her most exclusive social circle. It was a coronation of sorts, a public validation that wiped away months of shame and isolation in a single evening, and Cecilia felt as though she could finally breathe freely for the first time since her father's death. As midnight approached and the ball began to wind down, Alexander led Cecilia onto the dance floor for the final waltz of the evening, and as they moved together in perfect synchronization, she realized that this moment represented more than just social triumph or romantic vindication. It represented the completion of a journey from brokenness to wholeness, from isolation to belonging, from a marriage born of tragedy to a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine love. The girl who had hidden a dagger in her wedding gown, consumed by hatred and thoughts of revenge, had been transformed into a woman who understood that true strength lay not in violence or bitterness, but in the courage to forgive, to trust, and to build something beautiful from the ruins of the past. The months that followed the Pemberton Ball saw Cecilia's transformation from social pariah to one of the most respected women in London society, a change that felt almost miraculous in its completeness, but which she understood had been earned through her own resilience and Alexander's unwavering support. Invitations flooded Ravenswood Manor, hostesses now competing for the honor of entertaining the Countess, whose love story had captured the imagination of the Tun and whose grace under pressure had won even the hardest hearts. But more importantly than the social acceptance, Cecilia had found something far more valuable in her marriage to Alexander, a partnership built on honesty, mutual respect, and a love that had been forged in the fires of shared pain and hard-won understanding. They had learned to talk to each other about everything, from the smallest details of daily life to the deepest fears and hopes that shaped their inner worlds, and in doing so had created a bond stronger than any that might have formed under easier circumstances. Alexander had changed as well, the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long finally fading as he found peace in Cecilia's forgiveness and in the life they were building together. He had resigned his military commission, telling the king that he had given enough years to war and wished to devote himself to his estate, his wife, and the family they hoped to build. The decision had surprised many who knew him as a man defined by his military identity, but those closest to him understood that the general who had crushed the Hartwell Rebellion had died on the night Cecilia chose to forgive him, and the man who remained was someone gentler, more complete, finally able to live without the crushing weight of guilt and regret. Together they poured their energies into Ravenswood, improving conditions for their tenants, establishing schools for the children of the estate, and creating a home that reflected their shared values of compassion, justice, and the belief that every person deserved dignity, regardless of their birth or circumstances. A year after the Pemberton Ball, Cecilia stood in the same private chapel where she had once discovered Alexander kneeling in anguished prayer. But this time she was not alone, and the atmosphere was one of joy rather than sorrow. In her arms, she held their infant son, Edmund Alexander Thornfield, named in honor of the grandfather he would never meet and the father who had learned to carry his legacy with love rather than shame. As she looked down at the tiny face of her child, she felt the final pieces of her broken heart click into place, understanding that this was not just a baby, but a symbol of redemption and new beginnings, proof that life could spring from even the darkest tragedies. Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and together they christened their son in a quiet ceremony attended only by close friends, including several who had once been her father's supporters and who now saw in this union a kind of healing that transcended politics and old grievances. The years that followed brought more children, brought deeper love, brought a contentment that neither Cecilia nor Alexander had imagined possible on that terrible wedding night when she had stood with a dagger in her trembling hands. Cecilia became known throughout England not as the traitor's daughter who had married her enemy, but as Lady Ravenswood, a woman of wisdom and compassion who used her position to advocate for reforms that echoed her father's ideals while working within the system rather than against it. She had found a way to honor Edmund Hartwell's memory, not through violence or bitterness, but by living a life that embodied his principles of justice, dignity, and the fundamental worth of every human soul. And Alexander, the general who had once been defined by duty and death, discovered that his greatest victory had not been won on any battlefield, but in the quiet moments of a marriage that had taught him the meaning of grace, forgiveness, and unconditional love. Dear listener, perhaps you are facing your own impossible situation tonight, trapped in circumstances that feel like a prison with no escape, surrounded by people who have judged you unfairly or written your story in ways that deny your true worth. Perhaps you carry wounds from the past that make it hard to trust, hard to hope, hard to believe that anything beautiful could ever grow from such painful soil. Cecilia's story reminds us that our value is not determined by other people's opinions or by the tragedies that have shaped us, but by the choices we make in response to those circumstances. She teaches us that forgiveness is not about excusing the harm that was done or pretending the pain never existed, but about refusing to let that pain define us forever, about choosing to build something new rather than remaining chained to bitterness and revenge. And Alexander's transformation shows us that even those who have caused harm, even those who carry crushing guilt, can find redemption through genuine remorse, through consistent action, and through the courage to be vulnerable enough to love and be loved. Your story is not over, no matter how dark this chapter may seem, and sometimes the people or circumstances that appear to be your enemies may actually be the unexpected path to your greatest growth, your deepest healing, and a future more beautiful than anything you could have imagined in your pain.